in outcomes. And Marcella's work on the tsetse fly and malaria, all these sort of connected to long-term outcomes. But there's not much in economics. There's not really much in terms of how to organize the thoughts regarding disease and production. There's a lot more in the side of the historians. So I'm going to try to organize some of the thoughts that historians have provided. And if you want, the starting line is going to be McNeil's Plagues and People. Sorry, it froze. Okay, so this is what I'll do. There's going to be a theory component. I'm going to try to keep it brief. I'll give you 2 pictures and I'll put 1 slide with the information, but not really sophisticated. We have some RCTs. This is the Kremer-Miguel paper where we actually try to measure externalities. I'm going to use that as a launching pad, and I'm going to build from my theory and a connection with their model. And I'm going to show that TFP actually increases quite dramatically when you think about health improvements. Externalities are big order. That's what it means. And perhaps the most interesting part is I'm going to try to document in some subtle ways the effect that segregation by disease had in different ways society was organized in the past. And this is a wide range of institutions, including the caste system and other sort of forms of distance. So this is the theory, and it's going to be a 2-minute presentation. Think about a line or a city organized along the line 0, 1, and there's going to be 2 types of people, healthy and diseased. For now, they're going to, in this paper, they are perfectly observable. Imperfect information is quite interesting, and I have a separate paper dealing with that. But for now, you can see who's healthy and who's not. And production is pairwise because you need a social activity, so you cannot do it independently. Now, within each community, you're going to be bumping with all the people in that community randomly. And what that means is if there's someone unhealthy in your group, in your city, in your community, meeting them is unavoidable. At some point, you're going to end up crossing your paths with them. And this is going to be very costly. You'll see exactly how. What happens is when you organize society along these lines, you end up aggregating all these lines, all these communities into an aggregate production function. And the outcome of the planner problem is you have a social barrier. What you want is an economy where you can segregate as much as you can. And normally this is a social outcome, but it turns out it also has an aggregate effect on production. Of course, the effect depends on the scope and the centrality of markets. So there's a lot of discussion of that in the paper. But what it does is it actually induces a way to optimally misallocate resources. You want to separate as much instead of grid the groups together. So this is the 2 pictures, the first one that I promised. So imagine the city along the horizontal axis, 0, 1. You have a gamma mass of people. Gamma is the fraction of healthy. You have 2 ways of setting them in the city. You can integrate them so that every community has a fraction gamma of healthy people and 1 minus gamma of unhealthy people. You look at any community, all of them are the same. And by the way, the logic works with any group. That's in the paper. So you can do it, and all communities are identical. This is integrated. Basically, you have the 2 groups in every community. Or you can have a segregated assignment where you only have healthy people, the mass goes to 1 in a fraction gamma. And there's a fraction 1 minus gamma where you have all the unhealthy people. This line is what I mean by a social barrier. You only get people in one side of the city or in one side of the street. Now, the question is, what determines whether you have an integrated or segregated assignment? Time goes fast. So this is the whole theory. F is going to give you production. And if you end up having a production with 2 healthy individuals, this is the highest production you can get. If you end up with 2 diseased individuals in the group, this is the lowest production you can get. When you mix them, it really depends on how you construct the average. The average here is going to be a generalized mean. So mu1, which is the red line, is the simplest average, the arithmetic mean. And this is just half of the productivity of the healthy, half of the productivity of the disease. In this case, the mixing really drops the production of the healthy group, but increases dramatically the production of the disease group. So the gains are by far larger than the losses. Now, the problem is when you have spillovers, the mean is not necessarily in the average. If a healthy individual meets a diseased individual, maybe the healthy becomes completely sick. This is contagion. And if that's the case, the mean is going to be pushed down. And in fact, in the paper, there's a proposition that says when the weight of the average is sufficiently low, the losses are going to be identically to the gains. And in any point below, you're going to be inducing segregation, because at this point, the loss is going to be much larger than the potential gains. So this is the theory. The mean is formed by a CES. This is an increasing, you have all the nice properties, and production is just a generalized CES. And because this is random, everything happens in proportion to the mass of individuals in the economy. So that's mostly the problem of sorting. Now, why does it matter? Well, you can show that when you aggregate all these individuals in all these communities, you come back to an aggregate Cobb-Douglas production function. And in this function, the labor input varies with the quality and the quantity of the labor force. This is the traditional representation. But you also find that measured productivity, what we would call aggregate efficiency, depends on technological conditions. This is how much you produce technologically possible, but how population are sorted or organized in the economy. And this is exactly where the spillover is going to show up. And this is what I call a productivity effect of disease. Once you segregate people and you build up the economy, you lose efficiency in the aggregation. Now, there's several different ways to organize production and exchange. You can imagine groups in pairs, you can imagine centralized, you can imagine spillovers or not. And those exchange and production protocols are organized in the paper. But the key idea is there's always, because this is a social activity, there's always something beyond the traditional proximate effect, and you end up having these productivity influences. Now, in the theory, everything hinges on one number. Well, two numbers, but one is critical, which is as the meetings between healthy and disease come together, how much is productivity for the healthy person going down, their labor productivity? That is determined by this parameter rho. Think of this in the CES production function. This is the elasticity of substitution. So if this was the Leontief case, the healthy individual will become unhealthy immediately. This is perfect contagion. If the spillovers were positive, this would basically make the diseased individual go all the way to become healthy. So this is a parameter that under segregation you cannot identify, because if people are already separated, you never see that number. Well, Miguel and Kramer had this very nice randomized control treatment with parasitic infections. And if you organize their findings, they estimate the effect on the control and the treatment, and they measure the degree of these externalities. And you apply the theory of the paper, you end up with a rho that is quite low. And if you use that number and some simple calibration in the different production exchanges that I have, you end up with efficiency gains of quite a big number. In development accounting, a third in terms of increasing efficiency is a huge, huge number. So that's sort of the potential side. Now I have like 7 minutes, maybe less. Now the last part of the paper, which is perhaps the most interesting to me, is what we used to call historical narratives. I want to think a little bit about how did society organize, production and exchange in the past, especially in response to disease. The problem is because there's a big misunderstanding on how disease works. You often have to read between the lines. There is no single paper argument that says, oh, we're segregating based on disease. So I'm going to give you a number of examples, and they're going to be along social distance, temporal distance, and geographic distance. And here I'm flying because I just, there's a lot of issues going around, but I'm going to sidestep all of them. The canonical example of social segregation is the caste system in India. And caste divides society according to rules based on the division of labor. You can see maybe in the screen that laborers, artisans, basically the Brahmins, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, who are above the pollution line, are divided along production. And it creates a social hierarchy with people above a line of what they call pollution, and even people who are excluded of the social order. What's interesting about the caste system is it regulates direct and indirect contact. And there are many examples of certain types of occupations that cannot be together. Particularly, these are occupations in which you require or observe some kind of externality or dirty task. This includes, and I cannot read my screen, basically dealing with the dead. There's a specific category called chandals, and they are in charge of burials, and they cannot even be in the same house as Brahmin. What McNeil and many others have argued is this is partly a response, as you see probably in the context of the colonial origins, this is partly a response of an economy that has very high disease spillovers and the inability to control them. So when populations get together, especially populations who have a differential disease exposure, the only way to cope is by creating some distance. In this case, that's social distance. It's not the only form. We all know what a quarantine is. I don't have to explain it anymore. Quarantines also create a form of distance. This is not a social distance per se. It's a distance created over time, 30, 40 days, a particular amount of time. Quarantines are interesting because they don't rely on social norms like the caste system. The caste is not legally enforced. In fact, it's illegal to enforce some of the discrimination rules. This is enforced by a state. So it's a legal form of segregation. And not only that, it's preventive, meaning even individuals who are not showing symptoms are segregated. So it's like, just in case, I want to segregate as much people as I can. Quarantines also emerge as part of that form of isolation. And if you look at the history of plague in Europe, quarantines appear to be quite successful because relative to the other side of the world, relative to the Ottoman Empire, quarantines were very helpful at keeping plague at bay. The last instance being Marseille in 1720, and the large sort of big city epidemic being London in the 1660s. Now, other forms of distance are not necessarily about time or about social order. They are necessarily or probably more concerned with space. One of those is the way we organize cities. There's a space use that gets regulated. These are zoning rules that are still present today, and they try to address the huge mortality observed in cities, industrial cities in the past. Now, those are specific examples about this form of social, temporal, or geographic distance. I'll give you two last because I have 2 minutes. The way exchange happened, yeah.
So we have 5 minutes left, including comments and questions. So yeah.
I was aiming for 20.
That's great. So that leaves a couple for questions.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry about that. It's early for me. I just woke up, so it's like the coffee is not strong enough. Trade is often organized in centralized markets, right? You've all been to a farmer's market. You've all been to plazas in Latin America where you have basically the police and the majors overseeing the exchange, decentralized that way. In sub-Saharan Africa, trade is conducted at the border of territories. And the way it works is one community brings goods to the border, leaves them there and returns. They send a signal, community from the other side do the exchange and look at the goods that they want. And if the trade is agreeable, they put gold and return to their place. The first group comes back. It's a bargaining process, sort of like the in iterations. And what historians have seen is that this is a very interesting response to disease spillovers. If you had a world with disease, contagious disease, and you implement a centralized market, you're going to run into the problem of basically spreading the disease. And in fact, when Europeans try to integrate different ethnic groups and different populations in Central Africa, they pretty much just created this massive spread of infectious diseases. The last one, which is perhaps the one you all are, or some of you or are or have experiences, if you look at the settlements in Latin America and to some extent in sub-Saharan Africa, they tend to be established at high altitudes. Part of the reason for that is because altitude is one of the most protective effects against disease. This is Coatsworth's word, basically. The concentration occur because disease environments are less deadly. Now, why are all these effects, and this is my conclusion slide, why are those effects interesting? The caste system, quarantines, the lack of centralized exchange, even the lack of temporal segregation, all those are path dependent. Once you establish a population very high in the mountains, it's very difficult to move that population. The Spanish did when they moved the capital of the Incas to the coast, and Brasilia moved, but these are very costly. Now, those costs are a consequence of disease, and these are sort of a manifestation of spillovers associated with social segregation. The social quarantines that we have in the caste system have been extremely difficult to eliminate. There's all sorts of regulation preventing that, but it's not going away. And so the idea of the paper is you want to think about disease in broader terms. You don't want to think about just the effects it has on labor productivity. You want to think about the way it organized society. And potentially it could have big effects on aggregate productivity. And it could help us understand how some societies in the past cope with integration and segregation in very different ways, ways that are still relevant for today. And with that, that's 20 minutes flat.
Great. Thank you so much, Javier. Okay, so we have just 2 minutes for, I guess, one quick question or comment. For anyone else that has comments or questions for Javier, please feel free to write them in the chat window thereafter. Are there any questions or comments? Okay,
I'll check the paper. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, we actually just have like a minute, but so I thought that was incredibly interesting. I feel that like you're kind of suggesting that the presence of disease and the implications of segregation can be huge and are plausibly underlying these historical systems of segregation across different dimensions, which seems like a very interesting, strong claim. It's not immediately obvious, as you suggested, like it's not like they were explicitly doing all of these things, maybe some of them. So I find that fascinating, but I wonder, like you suggested that you have versions of the model with imperfect information. One thing that caught my attention is that in the model, people are segregating diseased and healthy people, whereas all of these or most of these sources of segregation, these dimensions that you illustrated, are actually not based on a line or a clear line between healthy and disease. So that seems like an interesting dimension to explore. And then the other thing that struck my attention is the fact that many infectious diseases are kind of temporary. So you seem to be like thinking mostly of something that's kind of like binary, and at least in the baseline. Anyway, thank you so much. I wish we had more time for discussion. I would love to talk more, but okay. I should pass along to our next presenter. Pedro, are you ready?
Oh, let me just share my screen here. Okay, can you see the screen? Huh?
Yes.
Yes, it's not full screen mode, but we can see it.
Oh, yeah? Just... Oh. Now it's forward or not?
No.
Not
yet. No, but
okay.
Yeah, I think it's yeah, perfect. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. So thank you for the organizer for the opportunity to present our paper here in such an amazing event. Today we present the paper Agrarian Elites Education in Structural Transformation. It's a project that I have with Claudio Ferraz from UBC. So, okay. So human capital is a fundamental driver of the structural transformation. So during the 20th century, we have evidence that, for example, countries that start with the higher levels of schooling industrialize fastest in general because they adopt more modern technologies and grow more over the time. However, the investment in schooling, they are absolutely unequal across countries, and even within countries or within area regions, there is a huge difference between the investments in human capital. And the big question here is, why did the difference emerge and how that difference persists, and what were the consequences of that for the structural transformation? So that's the big questions for our paper here. So what are you doing in this specific paper? You test whether the political power of the agrarian elites in the early 20th century in the state of São Paulo in Brazil explain different patterns in the expansion of the max schooling and how it's have consequence for the structural transformation across the municipalities. But of course, the problem for test that I thought that the agrarian elite's political power is associated with lower investment in education and its consequence for the economic development or the structural transformation. The problem is how to measure the political power for agrarian elites, because most of the papers, in general, they use land inequality as a proxy for the agrarian elite's political power. So, but the problem of the land inequality is that you cannot separate what is exactly a political inequality and an economic inequality, right? So we exploit a new data for Brazil from the voters by occupation in 1905 to create a proxy for the political power of the agrarian elites at the beginning of the 20th century. And you identify the elected politicians, and we match the surname of the elected politicians in Brazil in the 20th century with the surname from the land owners. So with that two variables, we think that we can create a measure for the political power of that elites. And use that variable to look at the impact of the agrarian elites' political power on education and on structural transformation over time. So the idea of the paper here is more analyze the dynamics of the time and not exactly just a long-term effect. It's more the dynamics over the time. Okay, so those 3 points from the Brazilian historical background. So in 1891, we have a new constitution, and the new constitution basically took away voting restrictions based on income, but introduces voting restriction based on wage, literacy, and gender. Just males with 21 years or more and literate can vote at that time. The consequence of that change was a decrease in the franchise rate for Brazil, because basically in the beginning of the 20th century there is no public education, and the number of schools was so low. So in general, we have a decrease in the franchise rate. And also in that constitution, basically the constitution decentralized the tax collection, specifically the exports tax collection, and basically increase the responsibility of the local elites to fund the state education and the municipality education. And our focus here, as I said, is the São Paulo in Brazil. And São Paulo is an interesting case because São Paulo grew a lot during the 20th century based on the exportation of coffee for the international markets, but there is a huge transformation in the economy of the state of São Paulo, shifting workers from agriculture to manufacturing. The elite of the state of São Paulo changed over the time, so we think that is an incredible setting to exactly analyze how the agrarian elite political power at the beginning of the 20th century is associated or not with expansion of mass schooling over the time, and how that it's changed over the time. Okay. So those two the data we work here with three new data. The first one is the number of voters by occupation in municipalities from the Mapa do Eleitorado. So the Mapa do Eleitorado, we have by municipalities the number of voters by occupation, but as we see, the franchise rate here is so small. Just 3.5% of the population was voting in 1905. So we think that for example, that people that vote here, they are part of the elite of the municipalities. They are part of the local economic and political elites of that municipalities. So with that data, we create a variable that is the share of the agrarian voters over the total number of voters in 1905 as a proxy for the political power of the agrarian elites. Here is just to see in general, less than 4% of population are voting, and when we look just the voting population, in general, average 60% of that people voting, they are farmers or landowners. So as you see, it's a small part of the population that was voting at that time. So the second data is to connect the elected politicians with the landowners. So we digitize from newspapers the name of the politicians elected in 3 times in the 20th century, at the beginning, in the middle, and in the 60s. And we digitize the name of the landowners in 1920 census. And we merge and we connect the surname of the landowners with the surname of the elected politicians to see how they are connected. So here's just the percentage of politicians with the same surname from our landowners. We see over the time a decrease in that share. In the beginning of 20th century is more than 60% is connected. In the 50s and the 60s, it's dropped to like 40%. And but the idea here is to associate the agrarian elite political power with education outcomes. So we also digitize a lot of education outcomes from the Brazilian census, exactly to try to understand how the agrarian elite political power is associated or not with, for example, literacy rates of the time. Okay, so our data is basically a cross-section covering 161 municipalities in the state of São Paulo between 1920 and 2010. Okay, so we collected a lot of controls, and basically the idea here is to trace the effects of the agrarian elite political power over the time until 2010. Okay, so the empirical strategy. So we don't have like a super different IV or something like that. It's not the name of game here. Basically, what you do is in the first time is do a cross section, trying to control for everything that we have to see how the agrarian political power is associated or not with the expansion of the mass schooling over the time. But for 2 outcomes, the literacy rate and the share of workers in agriculture, manufacturing services, we can follow that variables across all Brazilian census. So for that outcomes, we can do like a panel data to do like an event study analysis, just to trace the effect over the time of the agrarian elite political power on literacy rate and on structural transformation over the time. So in that case, we control for time fixed effect and municipality fixed effect to exactly to see how is the dynamic of the effect over the 20th century in Brazil. So now the results. The first results, we can summarize the first results in that correlation here. Here we have the percentage of local politicians that have the same surname from a landowners in 1920. And that politician, they were elected between 1913 and 1922. And we have here the share of the voters that pertains to the agrarian elites. So what we see is a positive correlation between the share, the agrarian elites' political power, and the share of the politicians that they are connected to the agrarian elites. And the consequence of that is that the agrarian elite political power is also associated with lower literacy rate in 1920 in the short run. So it's the agrarian elite political power in 1905 is associated with a low literacy rate in 1920. But of course, there are a lot of things happening here. So the idea is exactly, so for example, maybe the franchise rate is explaining all that effect. So we control for the franchise rate. So maybe the geography is important because, you know, most of the development of São Paulo is associated with the production of coffee. That's associated with geography. So we control for geography. So we control for land inequality. We control for transport infrastructure. We control for baseline education. We control by socioeconomic characteristics in the baseline, like, for example, the share of people working in agriculture, the share of people working in manufacturing, the share of immigrants, and we also control for the number of land owners in 1920. And the effects is still here, so it's like a robust effect. In general, the share of farm workers is associated with a more connection to the agrarian elites, more connection between the local politicians and the agrarian elites. And the same for literacy rate. And as you see, there is the magnitude of the estimates do not change a lot. We even control it for everything that we have for that time. So in general, one standard deviation from the agrarian elite's political power is associated with a reduction in the literacy rate in 22%. And why that happening? That happening because the agrarian elite's political power invested less in education. Here we have data for example, the percentage of children attending school, the number of teachers, and the number of schools in 1920s. And the political power of the agrarian elite in general is associated with a reduction of the investment in education, in children attending school, in teachers, and schooling. But how does education change over time? Because I know the idea of the paper here is analyze the dynamics. I think we think that is the most important part of the paper. So to summarize what we see as across the 20th century, we split our agrarian elite political power in two groups, two groups of municipalities with low agrarian political power and a high agrarian political power, below the median of the distribution. And what I see that at the 19th century, basically there is no difference in literacy rates between that municipalities. With the start of the 20th century here, we see an increase in the gap in the literacy rate between that two groups of municipalities. And the gap will increase until the 50s. After the 50s, we see a decrease of a convergence of the municipalities over the time. So another way to see that is using our panel data and do like an event study analysis and trace the effect over time. So what we see in the 20s, the agrarian elite political power is associated with lower literacy rates. The effect persists until the 50s. After the 50s, there is a decrease in the magnitude of the effect in the 60s and the 70s. And after the 70s, we don't see any more effects of the agrarian elite political power on the literacy rates. So to look like that, there is a convergence over the time of the literacy rate, on literacy rates, okay? But and what's the consequence of the lower investment in education of that municipality for the economy of that places? So the consequence is that the low investment in education delayed the process of modernization of that economies. So here is event studies again, but now looking for the share of workers in agriculture, manufacturing, and the service sector. So municipalities with a high agrarian political power, they took longer time to shift the workers from agriculture to manufacturing and the service sector. And also in the 70s, the effect is no longer significant. So there is a convergence of the share of workers in that sectors after the 70s. So it's look like that affects those persists until the middle of the 20th century. So the question now is, why does education change after the 50s? Why there is a convergence of the literacy rates after the 50s? So we also collected the name of the elected politicians for 1951 and for several elections between 1963 and 66. So, and here, what we do is we match the surname of that politicians elected with the surname of the list of the land owners that we have from the 1920 census. So that's, and that match, we create like a variable for the connection between the political elites, the elected politicians, and the land owners. And what we see is that in the 50s, there is a change in the identity of that politicians elected. So the agrarian elite political power is not more associated. In the 50s, those associated increase in the connection of the vice mayor, but it's not a strong effect. In the 60s, there is no effect. There is no relationship between the agrarian elite political power and then a connection of that politician. So it looks like that there is a change, there is a modification in the identities of the politicians after the 50s, after the middle of the 20th century. And maybe there is that change in the identity of the local political elites that explain that convergence of the time in the educational outcomes.
Pedro.
I just have more time.
We have about 4 minutes left, including time for questions and comments.
Okay, I will finish in 1-2 minutes. It's great. Okay. So the consequence of that is that for the agrarian political power, the magnitude of the effects of the agrarian political power on the education inputs decrease over the time. So for example, for education, even the 4 is not more significant, the effect. For the teachers, it's just significant in the 60s, and after that's not more significant. And for children attending school, there is a huge drop in the magnitude of the association between the agrarian elite political power and that inputs in education. So the change in the identity of that local politician maybe is impact the investments in inputs for education. And the last questions is the consequence in the long term. So what we see in the long term, that there is a shift in the impact from the primary education to more higher education. So in the long term, we still see that the agrarian elite political power is associated with less people, for example, with completed middle school or less people in the universities and so on. And the consequence of that is that the agrarian elite political power is associated with a reduction in the income per capita in 2010. But to see the effect here is not a huge impact. It's just a small impact. Okay, so if you see just that tables look like that, oh no, maybe it's not a relevant question. Maybe the agrarian elite political power, no, the effect's too small for today, so maybe it's not relevant. But what that table do not show is that the dynamic over the time. how that agrarian elite was important in the expansion of mass schooling until the middle of 20th century, and how that elite changed over the time and the impact decrease, and there is a converse over time of the municipalities. So just the conclusion, we show that agrarian political policy associated with reduction in the investment in education in the early 20th century. The educational backwards persists for many decades until the 50s. And after that, there is a change in the identity of the political elites. And we think that change in the identity is associated with the convergence of the municipalities in the educational outcomes. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Pedro. Okay, we have exactly 1 minute for comments and questions. Mateo, please go ahead.
I'll try to make it quick. I think I have two points that will really sell me. I'm all for the idea that some elites block investments in education and so on. But here it's hard for me to distinguish, is it about elites or is it just about the structure of the economic activity in a different place, that you're just capturing that if you have an agrarian society, who are going to be the rulers are people who have farms and who are landowners, but there's nothing necessarily about the landowners to block education. Maybe there's less demand for people that work in the agricultural sector to get schooling. And I think you can see a little bit of that when you show the later results, and you see a difference in the children attending a school, but you don't see a difference in the number of schools, for example, even when elites have already changed. And so for me, that's the biggest challenge, is how to distinguish how to drive the point that this is something about elites, and not if you have, say, the other extreme, and municipality that is the people in power are just peasants in an agrarian society, you would have probably the same outcome. That's it.
No, no, it's a very important question. So what you do here in our specification, we control for the share of workers in agriculture, manufacturing, the service sector in 1872. And including as a robustness test, we include like the share of workers in agriculture in 1920 as a bad control, just to see if the effects change or not. And there is no change in the effect of the agrarian elite political power in 1905 and the expansion of the education. So yeah, but it's the data that we have. So the best we can do is like control for that structure of the economy. But you're right, we need to be careful if that's a super important point.
Guys, sorry to interrupt. We should move on. Feel free to continue on the chat window. We're gonna let Felipe Valencia go now. Felipe, are you here?
I am. Hola, Martin.
Yeah. Hola, Felipe. Are you able to share?
I'm not. Do I need some screen sharing privileges?
Thanks. Okay, there you go. Thank you so much, Juan.
Yes.
So 20 minutes total, 22 total?
22 total. I'll let you know when there are 5 left, including time for questions. Go ahead, Felipe. Thank you so much.
Sure. Can you see the full screen or?
It's not
on full screen.
Full screen.
Okay, I'm doing the full screen.
We still cannot see full screen. Oh, yeah, perfect. Go ahead. Adelante.
Okay. So thanks a lot, everyone, for connecting, and the organizers for including our paper. So this is joint work with Jen Alex Garcia at Oregon State, Laura Schecher at Wisconsin-Madison, and Jessica Shu, who was a former student of Laura and Jessica. And here we are focusing on the long-term impact of conflict in a particularly extreme case, which was the War of Triple Alliance in South America. And we titled the paper Country of Women, given the extreme gender imbalance after the war. And this 3-to-1 female to male ratio is gonna come back in the paper, as we would see. So kind of the big picture motivating questions for this paper are twofold. One is, what is the socioeconomic impact of skewed gender ratios? So this happens a lot in today's world. I'll show you a few examples. And I think what's interesting and nice here is that we can follow this in the short, medium, and long run. And kind of the converse of that is, what is the long-term impact of conflict? And of course, there are many conflicts, but in particular with respect to demographic patterns. So there are many wars, but few of them as destructive in terms of these gender ratios, sex ratios, as the War of Triple Alliance. And that's why we think that this deserves a closer look. In the world, there are many instances where you would have gender imbalances. The famous work by Amartya Sen, the classic missing women, follow-up papers, for instance, by Shiwan Anderson and Deborah Schray, and a general survey by Paola Giuliano, just showing how some historical shocks, obviously including conflict, can affect the gender ratio. So you can think of kind of two scenarios. You would have too many males, and that's kind of like the more modern version of things. If you think about selective abortion in China and India, Nancy Chian, for instance, has work on that. And also migration. So anytime we have kind of like this gender selective migration, think about males going to Europe or males going from Mexico to the US, you would have kind of like that phenomenon, obviously for the goers and for the stayers. So for the stayers, you would have the reverse shock. Historically, you would have things like the California gold rush. There's a couple of nice papers on that, and these penal prison colonies in Australia, where you have a bunch of males going to a certain place for a short-term period of time, for instance, minors, or in this case, prisoners in the last one. Or you could have too many females, right? So that's kind of like the case that we're observing. So you have migration, and again, like for instance, the stayers in the areas of Mexico, that's work that my co-author Jen Alex has looked at, or also other types of migration in urban areas in the US. And obviously a lot of work historically looking at the absence of men after World War I and World War II. Here we're going to focus on the Triple Alliance War. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the war, but it happened from 1864 to 1870, and it killed around 70 to 90% of Paraguayan men, according to the kind of like the consensus estimates. Obviously, this is a huge and devastating shock. It's documented to be one of the largest gender shocks in history. So the question is, first to document the shock, of course, but then to look kind of what could be the different impacts of this shock in the very short term. We're going to look at illegitimate births or births out of wedlock, marriages, female education, employment, and kind of like quote unquote female empowerment in the long term. And did these effects persist in the very long term or not? That's kind of like this paper and our contribution to this sex ratios literature. So let me tell you a little bit about the war. So the Triple Alliance War, you see the dates above, it erupts from a political infighting between the Colorado and the Blanco party in Uruguay. These are local parties in Uruguay that have alignments with the different regional powers in South America. And these elections, in a way, like are kind of the spark that initiates the fire in the conflict. At the beginning, Brazil invades Uruguay, again, because of these kind of like conflictual results. Eventually, Paraguay declares war on Uruguay. If you see the map, you need to cross Argentina from Paraguay to get to Uruguay. Argentina refuses permission for Paraguay to cross to Uruguay, so Paraguay declares war on Argentina. And then a quote-unquote triple alliance composed by these three countries, i.e. Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay, fight against Paraguay. So that's kind of like what prompted the war. A bit more deeply of why the war, the fact is that Paraguay is growing as a regional power, so that's altering the kind of the balance of power in the region. So you have Mariscal Lopez, who you see there in the left, who plays an essential role. Essentially, at the beginning, it is not super clear who's going to win, but at some point it's clear that Paraguay is going to lose, but he is literally saying that he's going to fight until the last drop of blood and quote unquote die with his country, muera con mi patria, and literally like he fights until he's killed in the famous battle of Cerro Corá in March 1st, 1870. And that leads to more or less 60% of Paraguayan population dying, around 90% of their men. The consensus estimate, kind of like the more conservative one, is 70% of men. But part of I think of our contribution is to show these staggering losses. And these are 440,000 casualties in total, around 140,000 from the Triple Alliance side, most of them from Argentina and Brazil, very little from Uruguay. And 300,000 in Paraguay. So the kind of the rough estimates is that the post-war gender ratios are going to range from 1/3 or 1/7, returning to 1.39 by 1899. So these are so extreme that actually we're going to use the converse, so 3 female per man, 7 female per man, instead of like just having kind of the 0.3, 0.7 estimates. Okay. So how are we contributing? I think mostly through data is kind of a deep economic history paper. So we are going to have geolocated battles and marches, kind of like where the war is going on, a very nice statistical and kind of like daily plan of the battles by Jagli and Bordon. And that shows like, did the soldiers sleep here? Did they fight there? Did they go here to this little town or to this big city? Baptismal and marriage records. In this short presentation, I'm going to show you kind of like the baptismal side of things and what you get from ancestry. We scrapped that, so we have a large number of observations. Historical data as well to kind of like confirm what's out there from the historical Paraguayan census side and statistical yearbooks, and the usual set of variables, control variables like geography and weather characteristics that you can think of, as well as modern data collected from IPUM, so the censuses from, again, Paraguay, Brazil, and Argentina. So what we're exploiting is the fact that even though, I mean, obviously the war was a big shock, it was concentrated in some areas more than others. So we're going to focus kind of like in the quote unquote older Paraguay, and how the war, you see like it's coming from Brazil, and they're the big battles, some of them you can identify there, like Cerro Corá, Corrientes, etc. And like the troops are marching through the country, and there's going to be kind of like an intensive margin treatment, which is what we're going to exploit, which is within Paraguay, where are these battles or fought, or where are the soldiers passing. And there's kind of like a natural progression of the war, again, from 1864 to 1870. We're not going to be focusing on the Paraguay, so that's the modern map of Paraguay. We're not going to focus on El Chaco, so the region around here, which is later from the Chaco Wars. We're going to be looking kind of at the core of Paraguay, so the area that is left after the war, and then kind of like the lost territory. So that'll be kind of our attempt towards identification of areas that were fairly similar in terms of culture and in terms of history. I mean, so much that they were claimed to be Paraguayan. If you saw the map of the very beginning, like these areas that are kind of like, is it Paraguayan, is it Argentinian? And then we're gonna like contrast with the nearest municipalities or the nearest provinces. So kind of like to see whether there's an effect, even if potentially you were historically owned by Paraguay, or at least claimed by Paraguay. So I'm going to show you kind of like the gender ratios. This is going to be mostly visual. And then we're going to show you also mostly visually the results on illegitimate births. And then I'm going to kind of like move to the what happens with education, student enrollment, teacher ratios. And then if there's time at the end, I'm going to kind of like show you the very, very long term and what we think is going on there. Okay, so in terms of identification strategy or estimation strategy, we are using, as I showed you before, kind of the within country variation and between country variation with these nearest neighbors. Essentially, Paraguay versus the neighboring provinces and municipalities in Argentina and Brazil, or a lesser fixed effect. So we're going to look at a series of outcomes. So for instance, are you an illegitimate birth or not? Were you baptized? Were you married? Et cetera, et cetera. And kind of like the main identification here is just going to be, as I was saying, kind of the comparison between Argentina and its neighbors, and we're going to estimate this using OLS normally or fixed effects and adjusting for the spatial correlation that may emerge in these cases. At the within Paraguay level, we're going to kind of go at the intensive margin. So we're going to look more at, are you close to a municipality where there was a fight, where the troops marched, et cetera, et cetera. So kind of like more at the within Paraguay, because I mean, obviously it's hard to compare Paraguay against its neighbors, especially in modern times. So to see if there's also an effect kind of like more at the intensive margin, and same structure as before. So let me show you the results, or the first results at least visually. This is what we see that it's happening in terms of the actual gender shock. So to understand this is kind of like a cohort analysis. So from 1870s onward, what you see is that it's kind of like back to parity, right? So, I mean, there's no reason that births shouldn't be random at this stage. So you see that kind of like from the war onwards, so the kids that are born in 1870s, 76, 81, 86, and there's very close to gender parity, so 1-to-1. But if you were an adult when the war happened, so like essentially if you're 10 years old, 20, 30, 40, you see kind of like this extreme deviation. So it's there for Argentina. If you look at the whole of Argentina, it raises to 1.5 per 1 for the whole country. That's fairly high for modern standards. It's even higher in these neighboring provinces. So if you take Corrientes, for instance, which is kind of like the immediate neighboring province to the south of Paraguay, is 2.5, and it's a staggering 3.5 females per male for Paraguay if you look at the older cohorts. And this again is at the national level. So these numbers I think are extremely high. I mean, not unprecedented, but really extremely high. I can also show you here kind of like what happens more at the intensive margin. So now we are within Paraguay, and what you can see here is kind of for these war cohorts. So I mean the ones that were adults during the war, the closer you are to the war, now this is kind of the district level equivalent of before, there are places that are close to the war that have up to 7 females per male. And now again, we're talking kind of like unprecedented numbers, similar maybe to the Australia case. Obviously there it's exactly the opposite of 7 males per female. But part of our reasoning here is that, I mean, what we want to understand is whether the shocks are asymmetric or not, male-female and female-males. And obviously, right after the war, you see kind of like the effect disappears. The new cohorts are again 1-to-1. I mean, there's no reason that they shouldn't be balanced, regardless of how close or far you're to the war. So that's kind of like the documenting the extreme gender ratios, sex ratios that appear after the war. Then the next part is to look at the potential outcomes. So in the very short term, these again are baptismal records. So we can look at out of wedlock birth. So this means that when the kid is going to be baptized and you go to the church, and do you say, oh, this is the kid of this person and this person, or actually the dad is missing, or there's an X, or there's a blank, or literally it says that it's a quote unquote illegitimate birth. So what you can see here is that there are obviously different country rates for the three countries, for Brazil, Argentina, and Paraguay. But there's kind of like a short-term spike in Paraguay now, right after the war. So before we were looking kind of like surviving cohorts. Now we're looking from the war onwards, what's going on. Let me zoom a little bit. And so, okay, no. So essentially what we're going to look now, it's kind of like different dummies at different time periods. So if I zoomed a bit, which I'm a bit afraid to do here in this presentation, you see that essentially there's going to be kind of like a spike in illegitimate births, but actually then it's quickly converging back to 1900s, more or less, when the sex ratios also go back to normal. So what you can see here is that for different cohorts, there is an increase in illegitimate children after the war for Paraguay, and that's fairly stable and positive and significant until it goes back to normal in the 1900s. So we think of this as a short to medium effect, of the war of the sex ratios in this case. You can see the same thing kind of like in the very few cases where we have female and males divided in the historical census of 1886. So we see female students and fewer female students and fewer female teachers back in 1886, kind of on the more intensive margin, the further away from the battle. So this is just kind of like the first thing that we can see in terms of professions. So i.e. more females closer to the battle lines, i.e. more males were killed closer to the battle lines or closer to the marches. We can do this with the quadratic, we can do this with just a simple dummy, but kind of the idea is the same. And kind of what we want to do now is to take this in the very long term and see what are the potential effects or the potential patterns in modern days in terms of the labor outcomes.
Felipe, it just gets up 4 or 5 minutes left, including questions.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks. So what we look at here is kind of like the same structure as before. Obviously, now there's modern data, so we can look at all the things that we can care about in terms of the demographic structure of the household. Is the person being employed or not? Literacy, et cetera, et cetera. So let me just kind of like jump to the results in the interest of time. So this is again same structure. So Paraguay against its neighbors. So you see that there is more female-headed households. So now we're looking kind of like in the 1970s to the 2000s. So you see more female-headed households in Paraguay, especially for the Paraguayan female-headed households. And so that's what we see in this institution that in Paraguay is called concubinato. So here you just declare that you're unmarried and living with a kid. And this is essentially what the concubinato system is in Paraguay, not all the way to polygamy, but essentially having a partner and that it's not your formal partner, like it's not formal marriage, and you have a kid from that person. So we see that very prevalent in Paraguay. We can see that kind of like in the more extended sample and also in the more restricted sample. In terms of education, a little bit of a positive effect on primary education for Paraguay. If you add up the coefficient for Paraguay and then you subtract the one for males, for females, there's still a slightly positive coefficient, but essentially a lower employment if you look at column number 5 in Paraguay, and especially for Paraguayan females. So that's kind of like the cross country. Of course, in modern times, like now we're really comparing Argentina versus Brazil, which could have different labor markets, different informality rates, et cetera, et cetera. So we also do the same thing more at the within Paraguay level. So now again, this intensive margin of are you close or far to a march line? And you see now that again within Paraguay, so obviously like same institutions, history, culture, etc. There's more of these female-headed households, more of these unmarried households with a child. So this is the big coefficient that you see here. A little bit of the educational effects, though it's now it's mostly gone for literacy and it's only there for primary schooling. And actually now, which we think it's interesting, so less employment closer to the march line, but with this difference being positive for females. So you see that closer to the march line times the female, we get like kind of like this positive effect. So this is kind of a, I mean, I wouldn't call this as a positive thing, but in the very long term, like what happens with these demographic education and labor patterns, what we think is going on, and let me just skip the summary for now, is that there could be kind of a story of culture. I mean, obviously gender ratios are back to normal, as I showed you, starting like 1899 even. But we still see, I mean, the data is a bit sparse here, some impacts at the within Paraguay level of these questions about like, I mean, these kind of like very traditional sexist questions in the LAPOP and the Latino barometer of like, do you think that males or females would have the first right to a job? And here, this answer that it's mostly males. I mean, it's insignificant for the child suffering, but the question here is that would the child suffer if the mom goes to work? And the answer is largely yes. So we think that there should be something that it's kind of there, even though obviously the gender ratios are back to parity, and that might still have lingering effects, even though obviously the war is over. So let me conclude in the interest of time. So 150 years ago, there was the War of Triple Alliance that caused massive gender ratios to decrease all the way to 0.3. So that's almost unprecedented. So 3 females per male. We show that this leads in the short and medium and long run to more out of wedlock child rearing, so illegitimate births, more female education and differential effects for employment, lower in the Paraguayan side, but within Paraguay, higher on areas that were affected by the war. And the results, I didn't show you all the heterogeneous effects, but don't seem to be mediated by some of the usual sources of persistence in heterogeneity, so migration, agricultural productivity, but it seemed to be more in line with a more cultural story. So thanks a lot for your attention. And I think we still have like 1 or 2 minutes for questions.
Thanks, Felipe.
Thank you.
Yes. So yeah, we're actually a bit over time, but if there are any very quick comments or questions for Felipe, please go ahead.
Yeah, just ask a quick thing.
Yep.
So every time there's a war, there's always an adjustment in the age of marriage and the gap between men and women. So I would look at that. And the other thing is, I know that there's a lot going on, but this is a war that has massive effects. So I just don't know exactly what's the right margin to look at, and you seem to be shooting at different margins. So it's a little unclear to me what you're after. So that's just a quick note.
Yeah, so totally on the marriage side, I didn't show you that, but we observe exactly what you are conjecturing. So the females are getting married at older ages, males at younger ages, and this is decreasing the age gap, which you observe in other wars, World War II, World War I. And yeah, so here, I mean, we're trying to push kind of like this differential effect in the sense that like probably war affected the whole economy, but it's kind of like this extra interaction with females. So, I mean, if there's capital destruction or whatever, and so that's kind of like what we're looking at. And also kind of like this idea that it also affected Argentina or Brazil, but it affected Paraguay even more. But I take your point that maybe we should like be a bit more explicit about what we can capture or not. Thanks.
Okay, shall I start? Thank you so much, Felipe. Well, thanks everyone for participating in this session. We left the least interesting one, mine, for the end, but thanks for staying. Let me share my screen. Let's see if I can make it full screen mode. Can you guys see on full screen mode? No? Okay. I think I need to do this again. How about now? Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
So this paper is about land concentration and the organization of agricultural production more broadly in Argentina, and how this was shaped by political, institutional, historical features. This is joint work with Eric Edwards and with Gary Leibkap. And the basic motivation is that if we look at farm size across the world today, Argentina has huge farm sizes. We're going to compare the distribution of land in Argentina to the US. I'll try to argue that there's a region of the US that is an interesting benchmark for Argentine agricultural organization in the Pampas in particularly. Now, this sharp contrast between farm sizes in Argentina and other places, including the US, is not a recent thing. If we look historically, we also have this sharp difference between large states in Argentina and a very striking degree of specialization in ranching, as well as other distinctive agricultural organizational features like the prevalence of short-term cash tenancy contract. And this is very different from the Midwest, in particular the lower Midwest in the US, which is a geoclimatically similar region to the Argentine Pampas, where we have a prevalence of small-scale farms that relied on family labor and or on shared tenancy contracts that were longer terms. Now, there's a lot of literature on the implications of land concentration. So we know that this has ramifications for productivity, for long-term innovation. Part of this has to do with agency problems, as emphasized by the relevant literature in organizational economics as applied to farm production. There's also a number of implications about human capital investments. In fact, Pedro's work with Claudio suggests that in a neighboring country, we see historically that the power of large landowners is negatively associated with human capital investments. There's also work suggesting that it can affect density and income and wealth distribution with long-run implications. And there are also, this has been a big strand of literature for Argentina, as well as other countries, political economy implications at the country level. Now, in this paper, we take all of this as motivation, but we're not going to look at the consequences of large farm sizes, but instead, we're going to look at the origins. And as I said, we're going to compare Argentina with the US for reasons I'll explain in a couple of minutes. We're going to look in particular at farm sizes, but also at output mix, in particular, the degree of specialization in ranching and the prevalence of different types of tenancy contracts. Now, why do we compare Argentina with the US among all countries? Well, it's basically the similarity in geography and climate. We're going to be specifically comparing the Argentine Pampas with the southern part of the US Midwest, which had similar terrain characteristics, temperatures, levels of annual precipitation, and soil quality. And they were both cases of fast expansion and integration into the world economy during the trade boom of the late 19th century, early 20th century, producing a similar mix of agricultural products. Okay, so essentially the notion is that we're going to take two places that are geoclimatically very similar, and we're going to try and argue that the sharp differences that we observe have to do with factors that are not the geographic and climatic endowments, but rather the historical institutional factors. In particular, we're going to emphasize property right institutions, which were very different between the two regions, arguably due to their different colonial histories. What we're going to do empirically is to exploit subnational variation. So we're going to compare these two regions, but we're going to exploit the county level variation within each of these regions pulled together to examine how much can be explained of those subnational differences and of those cross-country differences, how much of that can be explained by geoclimatic factors. The key reason to do this is that there is a plausible alternative explanation for the differences between the US and Argentina, which is that they may have been different due to geoclimatic endowments. And this is kind of like in line with an interesting and influential view in economic history associated to the work of Engerman and Sokolov, but also others, that highlights how climate and geography can shape the organizational structures of economic production early on with path dependence in subsequent trajectories. What we find is that geoclimatic differences really cannot explain the differences in farm organization between Argentina and the US. Of course, this doesn't prove that institutional factors like the ones that were emphasized are the ones that underline these differences, but this does make it more plausible. Moreover, we show that it's not only about a cross-country difference between Argentina and the US, but within Argentina and within the US, there are different degrees of responsiveness. So we're going to find that farm sizes are bigger in Argentina, but also that within Argentina, farm sizes across different locations are less sensitive to geoclimatic differences. There is this notion that there is less adjustment. We also find that there are differential patterns in other locations, like crop mix or product mix, in particular, a disproportionately high level of ranching specialization in Argentina, which we think is associated with the prevalence of large landholdings, which are more conducive to the extensive nature of cattle grazing. Okay, so just a bit of a conceptual framework, very briefly. To have a flexible agricultural organization that can adapt to market opportunities, you need a set of conditions. In particular, you need property rights to be well-defined over a set of assets with conventional and measurable value parameters. We also need relatively low transaction costs so that whatever the initial allocations, the market can lead to adjustments through breaking up large properties, trading, and subsequent changes in agricultural organization to basically take the production in the direction where profit rates are higher. Now, in Argentina, the initial conditions persisted in our story because these conditions, conditions for flexibility in agricultural organization, they were not met. In particular, the issue in Argentina is that owning the land entailed not only the rights to exploit that productive asset, but it also entailed non-economic attributes, in particular, political and social power and status. And what this means is that you cannot unbundle these two things, and this basically increases transaction costs, making agricultural organization more rigid. Now, there's this notion, going back to Demsetz, that if the property rights regime does not allow for flexible adjustment in response to profit opportunities, there will be some sort of institutional change. There will be a pressure for the system to change and allow for adjustments that allow Asians to move towards those profit opportunities. However, this thesis is not unconditional. There are factors that can hamper such trends towards institutional evolution. And we think that the colonial legacy of Spanish institutions in Argentina implied not only that bundling of economic and political properties of land ownership, but also more inertia and rigidity in the overall system. There was nothing like the degree of flexibility that we see in the US, where there's a continuous readjustment of property right regimes so as to make land a marketable commodity and favor whatever adjustments in property rights need to be made in response to profit opportunities. Okay, so I basically anticipated quite a bit of this. Let me see if I need to add something. I guess that I've already said this, so I'm happy to come back if there are questions or comments about this later. But hopefully this broad contrast between the US and Argentina is clear to this audience. To some extent, this contrast applies to the histories of many Spanish colonies, where the initial conditions involve a high degree or relatively high degree of land concentration, but moreover, they involve a relatively high degree of rigidity in the farm organization and in the overall system of property rights institutions. Okay, so a little bit more about Argentina, where there's a large historiography on landed elites. The notion here of the bundling between economic and non-economic attributes of land has been widely studied in Argentine history, where land wealth was associated with distinguished socialization, which indirectly conferred political powers. The big landowners of Argentina participated in exclusive social clubs, cultural activities, elite sports, and in these circles of socialization, they established links with the political elite. It is not the case in Argentina, precisely because the predominant agricultural activities were not very labor intensive. It was either ranching or cereals, none of which is very labor intensive. So it wasn't like in other places where you have a political economy story where the landed elites directly control through different means the labor that they employ and therefore can use it for political mobilization. It was more of an indirect story where their power and wealth and the property of land as a signal of power and wealth allow them to establish links with the political elite that in turn gave them political influence and in many cases higher chances of getting political positions. And then the other part is this rigidity in the institutional system. And so one interesting aspect of Argentine history that that we discussed, but I probably won't have enough time to discuss, is that because of this institutional rigidity, because of the landed elites' convenience in keeping their large land holdings, the growth of cereal production had to take place through means other than breaking up large properties. And what they did is design a system of mixed production where they would rent out smaller plots of their big states to cereal farmers, which is a very special system that developed in Argentina and was very successful and can be interpreted as sort of like adjustment under constraints. Okay, so let me go ahead to the empirical analysis that we do. Let me just show you this picture. The contrast in initial allocations in terms of farm size between the US and Argentina is just mind-blowing. So if you look at these grids that the public institutions guiding the titling of land in early stages, just during the 19th century at different points in time, is just incredibly striking, to the point where the minimum plot that was sold in the main through the main laws that were used in Argentina in the late 19th century, the minimum plot, which was 50K by 50K, is just a little under the size of a whole township in the US, which involved dozens and dozens of plots and a central area for the public goods and the public administration offices. So the contrast in initial allocations is just incredibly striking. But what is additionally striking is that these were very persistent. Okay, so what we're gonna do to try and isolate the effects of institutions is analyze these two regions that were comparable in geography and climate. We pick a region of the US that is particularly similar in its terrain, elevation, in precipitation and soil quality. Our baseline sample in the US includes these five states in the lower Midwest, in the southern central part of the country. And then we also have robustness, including a few more states. And as you can see, these were relatively similar to the Argentine Pampas in elevation, precipitation, and temperature. And then what we're gonna do is consider a series of regressions where we have measures of agricultural organization in Argentina, and the US at the subnational level. And then we're gonna include on the right-hand side, temperature, precipitation, elevation, and potential productivity for different crops. And then we're gonna have an Argentine dummy. What this dummy is gonna capture is the overall difference in sizes or crop mix in Argentina that cannot be explained by these geoclimatic features. And so this is the distribution of the outcomes that we consider, and we are basically leveraging the subnational variation so that we can identify how much geography and climate can explain and how much they cannot explain of the difference between the US and Argentina. The overall difference in the distribution is just very striking. What you see here is the histogram for farm sizes in the US and in Argentina, and you can see that it's kind of like completely shifted. But then when we do it in the form of a regression, you see that the Argentine dummy is large and significant. And if anything, it gets larger when we account for geoclimatic features. So we have a huge difference between the two countries. But when we use the subnational variation to try and understand how much geography and climate explain, and then go back to the overall comparison, we see that it really cannot be about geoclimatic features, this large difference between the US and Argentina. And then if we look at this graphically, we see that, you know, the regression line can explain a lot of the variation across locations in both countries, but units in Argentina, the dark empty circles here, are disproportionately above the regression line. There's something there, something happening in Argentina that it's not at all about geoclimatic features. And then we're running out of time, so let me just show you one other result. Sorry, I actually just got completely lost in these slides. I think I was going back. Yeah, I don't know where I have what I wanted to show you. So let me see if, let me actually, we actually just have 1 minute left. So let me tell you the last thing I wanted to say, and then I'll try to pull up the graph while I hear any comments or questions. The other thing we show is that there's not only this overall difference, but there's less responsiveness across Argentine locations to geoclimatic features. If you run a split regression, you'll see that the R square, and it's just like the cloud of points in Argentina, is shows that really there's something there that is not reacting to geoclimatic features, while it is doing that in the US to a much larger extent. So we have like 1 minute left. I'm gonna pull up that graph, and in the meantime, I'm happy to take any questions or comments.
Martin, this is extremely interesting, and for like the whole discussion of like Acemoglu and Robinson against Engelman and Sokolov and all that type of thing. I was wondering your views, or if in the paper you have anything on. You can think about it in two ways. As you said, there's a rigid legal system in Argentina that is not there in the US, but there is also something about the initial allocation process, right? That even if the legal system and the way to define property rights and whatnot was very flexible in Argentina, the initial allocation process was influenced by the concentration of power and whatnot, that in the US it doesn't seem to be there. And in the US, I don't know about Argentina much, but in the US you see them kind of iterating what's the best way to distribute the land, and the goal in the US is make people move west. In Argentina, I don't know what and so how to separate initial conditions or colonial origins or whatever to the, and I understand both are related, but to the initial allocation process. That's one. And then the other one is how do you think about kind of the abundance of land in the US that kind of gives people an outside option to move, and then you got to make the process a little bit more streamlined. But overall, this is fascinating.
Yeah, these are fantastic points, Mateo. Thank you so much. So I'm gonna stay, and I don't know if they're gonna kick us out of this Zoom room, but feel free to stay. I just want to acknowledge that we're out of time. So, you know, thank you so much to everyone for participating. Yeah, so Mateo's points are super interesting and important. We do not try, and I actually don't know how we could try and disentangle the role of initial allocations from subsequent rigidity. It's kind of like we're saying our story is that these persistent differences are the outcome of the combination of both initial differences and subsequent rigidity. But you're absolutely right that those are conceptually distinct. You could have one without the other. and it'll be interesting to explore cases where you have variation in both and see the relative role. There's some work in the US that shows that there's also persistence in agricultural organization in the US. So for instance, there's work on like persistent effects of the Homesteading Act that suggests that even in a flexible setup, it's not like things are fully flexible and adjust instantly. And then your other point, I think it's super interesting. There are differences in sort of like the overall national trends. In the US, there's this fast process of westward movement that is incentivized by the federal government through the Homestead Act and other policies. You don't have that in Argentina. It may be that this has to do with the US was invested in colonizing and conquering the whole territory, and the conflicts with Native Americans, with indigenous peoples in the US, I think had a higher intensity. The population density of indigenous peoples in the US, in North America, was larger. And that may be part of it. It may also be that the Argentine government went and conquered the territory and slaughtered indigenous groups in a centralized way, whereas the US was sort of like relying on private citizens to do part of the job by offering them free land to settle. And then there's also the case that in Argentina, there's kind of like a cliff in soil productivity around the Pampas. And in the US, you have to go all the way to the mountain region I mean, the Midwest is super fertile. So it was a different process, and that may well be related to the persistence of differences. But that's not something that we have studied or that I can see an easy way to incorporate, but that's super interesting and important. Okay, so I took several minutes. Again, I'm happy to stay and keep talking. I'm happy to stay. Yeah, I'm happy to stay. Okay, so if you guys, but let me also say, I don't want to take up the whole thing. So if there are questions, so I see that Javier and Pedro are still here. I don't see Felipe, but if there are questions or comments for them, I'm also happy. We can go back to those.
Can I continue with yours? I had already emailed Javier, but I mean, in a sense, all you can